When people hear the words Torah and Old Testament, many assume they mean exactly the same thing. Both terms point to ancient scriptures. Both are central to faith traditions. And both are connected to Judaism and Christianity. But, while there is overlap, the Torah and the Old Testament are not identical. They differ in scope, meaning, and how communities understand them. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the Torah and the Old Testament, uncovering where they meet, where they differ, and why that distinction really matters. Let's start at the beginning. The Torah, in Jewish tradition, refers specifically to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. These are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In Hebrew, the word Torah means instruction, or teaching, though it is often translated simply as law. For Jewish communities, the Torah is the most sacred part of Scripture. It is seen as the foundation of God's covenant with Israel and contains stories of creation, of the patriarchs and matriarchs like Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and Rachel, as well as the dramatic story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. The Torah also holds the 10 Commandments, the legal codes, and the religious practices that shape Jewish identity and worship. Now, when Christians speak of the Old Testament, they're referring to a much larger collection of writings. The Old Testament includes not only the Torah, or what Christians call the Pentateuch, meaning 5 scrolls, but also books of history, poetry, wisdom, and prophecy. These include writings like the Psalms, Proverbs, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and many others. So while the Torah is part of the Old Testament, it is not the whole thing. For Christians, the Old Testament is the first major section of the Bible, followed by the New Testament, which focuses on the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. This difference in scope is important. For Jews, when they say Torah, they mean those 5 foundational books. In a broader sense, Jews sometimes use the word Torah to refer to all of Jewish teaching, including the entire Hebrew Bible and rabbinic traditions, but in its primary sense, Torah means Genesis through Deuteronomy. For Christians, the Old Testament contains those books, but extends much further. It covers centuries of Israel's history, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the words of the prophets, and songs and wisdom literature that continue to shape faith today. The way these texts are organized also differs. In Jewish tradition, the Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 main sections: the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Together, these 3 parts are known as the Tanakh, an acronym built from Torah, Nevi'im prophets, and Ketuvim writings. This is the complete Hebrew Bible as Jews understand it. For Christians, however, the same collection of writings is rearranged and translated into what they call the Old Testament. The order of books differs, and sometimes the number of books also differs depending on the Christian tradition. For example, Catholic Bibles include certain writings called the deuterocanonical books, such as Tobit, Judith, and the Maccabees, which Protestants generally do not include, referring to them as apocryphal or non-canonical. That means that if you pick up a Catholic Old Testament, it will have more books than a Protestant Old Testament, even though both contain the Torah. Jewish Bibles, meanwhile, do not include these additional writings at all, because they were not part of the Hebrew canon. This shows that what we call the Old Testament is not identical across all traditions, and it also shows why equating the Old Testament with the Torah can be misleading. Another key difference lies in how these texts are viewed religiously. In Judaism, the Torah is the heart of Scripture. It is read in the synagogue week after week, portion by portion, in a yearly cycle that covers all 5 books. Every Sabbath, a section is chanted aloud, and at the end of the year, the reading begins again from Genesis. This rhythm of Torah reading shapes Jewish worship, identity, and memory. The Torah scroll itself, handwritten by scribes on parchment, is treated with the utmost reverence. It is dressed in decorative coverings, adorned with crowns, and paraded through the congregation before reading. For Jews, the Torah is not just text. It is sacred presence, central to the covenant between God and Israel. In Christianity, the Old Testament is certainly respected and forms the first part of the Bible, but it is not given the same liturgical centrality as the Torah in Judaism. Christians read selections from the Old Testament in worship. It's often paired with readings from the New Testament and the Gospels. But the emphasis in Christian tradition usually falls on the fulfillment of Old Testament promises through Jesus Christ. That means Christians often view the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament, interpreting the earlier scriptures as pointing forward to Christ. This brings us to another important point: the role of interpretation. In Jewish tradition, the Torah is studied alongside layers of commentary, particularly the Talmud and the teachings of rabbis through the centuries. The Torah is seen as a living word that requires constant engagement, discussion, and interpretation. Debates about meaning are not only allowed, but encouraged, as a way of deepening understanding and applying the Torah to daily life. In Christian tradition, especially in early centuries, church leaders also wrestled with how to interpret the Old Testament. Some argued that Christians should distance themselves from Jewish law and focus solely on the New Testament, while others insisted that the Old Testament remained crucial for understanding God's work in history. Eventually, the Church settled on affirming the Old Testament as Scripture, but always as preparation for and fulfillment in the New Testament. This difference of emphasis explains why Christians may sometimes use the term Old Testament in ways that can sound dismissive, as though the Old has been replaced by the New. Jews, understandably, reject this framing, since for them the Torah and the Hebrew Bible are not old or outdated, but eternally relevant and binding. Many scholars and interfaith leaders today encourage Christians to refer to the Hebrew Bible instead of the Old Testament when speaking of Jewish scripture, as a way of respecting its continuing vitality. It's also worth noting the history of how these texts were preserved. The Torah, as written scrolls, was copied by hand for centuries. Ancient manuscripts, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, give us glimpses of how these texts looked over 2,000 years ago. The Hebrew Bible as a whole reached its final form in Jewish tradition centuries before Christianity took shape. The early Christians, however, mostly read these scriptures in Greek, using the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. That's one reason why the order of books and the inclusion of certain writings differs between Jewish and Christian traditions. The Septuagint included the deuterocanonical books, and because early Christians used it widely, those writings became part of the Catholic tradition. Later, when Protestant reformers insisted on returning to the Hebrew canon, they excluded those additional books, leading to the differences we see today. The languages of the texts also matter. The Torah and the rest of the Hebrew Bible were primarily written in Hebrew, with some parts in Aramaic. The Old Testament, as read by Christians, has been translated into countless languages, but its roots go back to Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. These layers of language and translation also affect interpretation. For example, certain prophecies in Isaiah, when translated into Greek, were read by Christians as pointing directly to Jesus, while Jews reading the Hebrew text might understand them differently. So where does this leave us? On the one hand, the Torah and the Old Testament overlap significantly. The Torah forms the foundation of the Old Testament, and both traditions hold those 5 books as deeply important. On the other hand, the Old Testament extends far beyond the Torah, including histories, prophecies, and wisdom literature that are not part of the Torah. The way these texts are read, arranged, and understood differs between Jews and Christians, reflecting different religious paths. For Jews, the Torah is the living heart of God's covenant, studied and celebrated endlessly. For Christians, the Old Testament is cherished but seen as part of a larger story that finds its climax in the New Testament. Both traditions treasure these texts but in distinct ways. And this is why it's so important to use terms carefully. Saying Torah when you mean Old Testament or Old Testament when you mean Torah risks blurring the differences. Understanding those differences not only helps avoid confusion, but also deepens appreciation of how Scripture functions in each tradition. So next time you hear someone ask, "Is the Torah the same as the Old Testament?" you'll know how to answer, the Torah is part of the Old Testament, but it is not the same thing. The Torah is the first 5 books, sacred and central in Judaism, while the Old Testament is the larger Christian collection that includes the Torah but goes far beyond it. And so, the story comes full circle. The Torah and the Old Testament are bound together by shared history, yet they lead into different worlds of faith. By seeing clearly what they share and what sets them apart, we not only gain clarity, but also respect the richness of both traditions. If this exploration helped you understand the distinction between the Torah and the Old Testament, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Buried Testament, where we uncover the layers of Scripture, history, and faith.